Hello, this is Jim Cooper, and welcome to this Vue.js Fundamentals module on getting started with the Vue CLI. In this module, we'll spend a few minutes gaining a high-level understanding of Vue.js applications, and then we'll dive into creating our first project with the Vue CLI. We'll even start writing some of our own code in this module, including building this homepage for the Build-A-Bot application that we'll build throughout this course. We're going to have some fun in this course using Vue to create a simple website for building and buying custom robots. This application will be rich enough to demonstrate all the fundamental concepts you need in order to create your own applications with Vue, but it will also be simple enough that we won't waste our time building unnecessary features that have no educational value. And this is what it'll look like when we're finished. As you can see, I can come to the build page and start customizing my robot, and I can build the robot that I want and then click add to cart to add it to my cart. And then you can see it shows up in my cart here, and I even show which robots I saved money on if they happen to be on sale. And back on the build page, I can click on any of these parts and learn more about the individual parts. This site doesn't seem like much, but there's a ton of concepts and learning built into this. It will be just enough to allow us to dive into things like creating components and child components, communicating between those components, routing and navigation, state management, and even API calls to a separate server. We'll even explore how to build and deploy this application to production. So let's jump right in and start learning about Vue. At the heart of a Vue.js application is the Vue instance. A Vue instance, or Vue app, is created whenever you call Vue.createApp. In a typical Vue application, you will only have one Vue instance. When you create a Vue instance, you will usually tell it to render your main app Vue component, which you do by importing your app component and then passing it into the create app call. The app component is your top level component in what will become a hierarchical component structure. So you can imagine your Vue instance wrapping your entire application, and inside that you have your app component. And the app component may have a child component, which then may have other child components, etc. This should feel familiar if you've written any Angular or React applications. The component structure is similar, other than the Vue instance. In a Vue application that includes routing, which is probably most Vue applications, there's another piece. Basically, instead of the app component containing other components, or maybe in addition to it containing other components, it will also contain a router view, which shows the content for the current URL. And as the URL changes, the content inside the router view is updated. And while there is a lot more to a Vue application, this is a pretty good conceptual overview of the main structure of a Vue app. To understand the rest of the details, let's jump into creating an app from the ground up. We're going to need a few tools installed to get going. First, we'll need Git installed. I'm on Windows, so I'm going to use Git for Windows, which can be downloaded from here. If you're on a Mac, you can install SCM Git from here. And if you're on Linux, you can just run a command like this one from the terminal. I'll go ahead and download and install Git for Windows. And then I'll run that, and I'll just use the defaults throughout the install. And now that that's installed, I have this new Git bash console that I can run. So we'll use that in a minute. And actually, while I prefer to use this bash console, sometimes Windows users have issues with it. So if you're getting weird errors, try using the Windows console window instead. The next thing I need is Node. I prefer to install Node using Node Version Manager, just because it makes it easier to switch between versions of Node as I develop different applications. On Windows, I can download that from here. For Linux and Mac, you can just run this command from the terminal. Of course, these each have their own README with instructions about installing them, so you may want to read through those for your environment first. But I'm going to go ahead and install this on my system. And I'll just use all the default options here too. Okay, now that that's installed, I'm going to open my Git bash console. On Windows, be sure to open it as administrator. Okay, now that I have MVM installed, I can just run mvm install, and then the version of Node that you want to install. It's recommended that you use this version for this course if you're following along to avoid any compatibility issues. And now I can just tell mvm to use this version of Node. Okay, we're good to go. with Git and Node now. If you have problems using NVM to install Node, you can try installing it directly from here. Just choose the correct installer for your system. Okay, let's get coding. We're going to use the Vue CLI to create our new project. If you're using Vue to create a project that you're going to deploy to a production environment, I highly recommend you use the CLI. The CLI represents a lot of thought and effort by the Vue team to create an environment where you can easily work in development and, when you're ready, create an optimized production build. So to get started, let's install the Vue CLI. We'll do that from the terminal. On Windows, we need to use the bash terminal we just installed. And then we just need to use npm to install the Vue CLI globally, like this. Typically, this is all you'll do to install the CLI. But for this course, we're going to install a specific version like this. If you're following along with this course, be sure to use this same version to ensure you don't run into any surprises or problems along the way. Okay, now that that's installed, we can use it to generate our project. So I'm in my dev folder where I want to create my project. And now I can just run this command. So this is going to create a new Vue project, and it's going to create that new project in a build-a-bot directory. Okay, so that brings up a series of prompts. Now, you might be seeing something a little different. If your prompts are missing color and the arrow keys don't work, then you'll probably need to run this command instead. This is a problem with the git bash console, and running this command should fix it for you. So just run this and you should be good to go. Okay, notice that I can choose from a default preset here, or I can choose to manually select which features I want included with my new Vue app. I want a little bit more control, so I'm going to choose manually select features. So you can see that the Vue CLI starts with a handful of out-of-the-box features to choose from. Each of the features listed here has the ability, when you select one, to do several things, including things like prompting you for more information on the command line, modifying the Webpack config, installing npm packages, and generating files. This is all based on a Vue plugin architecture, and the whole idea is to create a zero config environment, meaning they've done a lot of the thought to create all the Webpack and other configs so you don't have to worry about that. Now, usually that sort of thing makes me nervous because when framework developers say you won't have to worry about it, it usually means I'm going to have to worry about it and it's going to be a pain to work with when I do. And as you look at this out-of-the-box list, you might think, well, this is great if this list contains the features that I want, but what if I need something else? Or what if I don't choose something here and I want to add it later? Well, not to worry. Forget to install one of these? No problem, just add it later. Don't see a feature that you want? No problem, anyone can create a plugin and add it later. And there's a good chance you'll find that the community has created one for you. And when you do need to make changes to the Webpack config yourself, you can do that too, all without ever having to eject from the CLI. This is all part of an attempt to create a zero config or low config environment, and they've done a stellar job of it. Of course, if you need to do some custom configuration, you can do that too. You'll notice that the first option listed here is to choose your Vue version. This is so you can either choose the latest version or an older version of Vue. We'll leave that selected so we can choose our version. And then we also want Babel and a linter as currently selected. We're going to use a router and Vuex later, but we'll add those then so you can see how to do that. So I'll go ahead and hit enter to move ahead with these options. Now we get to select the version of Vue that we want to use, and we're going to be using the latest version of Vue, so I'll select Vue 3. And now we need to choose our linter options. And I'm going to go ahead and choose ESLint with the Airbnb config. I really like the Airbnb configuration for code styling, so I'll go ahead and select that. So I'll hit enter, and then I'm going to select lint on save so that it will execute my linter whenever I save a file. Now I'm going to go ahead and hit enter again. And then I have an option here as to whether to put my config in my package.json or in dedicated config files. And I like it in dedicated config files, so I'll select that. And then here I have the option to save all of these options that I've selected as a preset for future projects. If I do that, then when I create a new project in the future, I can select that preset instead of having to go through all these options again. But I'm just going to go ahead and say no here. Okay, so now it's generating our project for us and installing all of our npm dependencies. Cool. Now that that's done, let's take a quick peek at what it generated, and then we'll start writing some code of our own. So I'm going to open up my code editor, and I'm using Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to change directory into my new build-a-bot folder, and then I'll just type code dot, and that should start Visual Studio Code in this directory. I highly recommend VS Code for working with Vue because it has a lot of great Vue extensions that offer some incredible support for working in Vue. In fact, let's take a look at those extensions. So notice here that I have an ESLint plugin, a Viter plugin, and a Vue plugin. I recommend you install each of these if you're following along, or if you're going to be doing Vue development in Visual Studio Code. And then lastly, there are some ESLint settings that we want to configure here in our workspace settings. I've configured some ESLint rules for formatting Vue files. So notice here that I'm telling ESLint to validate HTML, Vue, and JavaScript files. And then notice down here that I have this setting that will fix any ESLint errors upon saving the file. These settings will make ESLint work well and make it easier to auto-fix small linting problems as we code. You can ignore the rest of the settings in this file. These are just my settings to get the font size and other things right for the course. And if you're working on Windows, there's one change that we'll want to make to this ESLint RC file so that it doesn't have any issues with the Windows style line endings. Right here in the rules section, we're going to add a rule to disable line break style checking like this. And then there's one more change that I'm going to make that just works better for formatting code for the course. You can ignore this one if you want, but I'm going to turn off the operator line break setting so that I'm free to format the code as necessary to fit on the screen for the course. And that's it. We should be set up now for ESLint. All right, now that we've got our editor set up the way we want, let's take a look at what the CLI generated for us. We'll start with the package.json file. If we take a look at the scripts in the package.json file right here, you can see that it created these 3 scripts for us, all of which call the Vue CLI service. The Vue CLI service manages a local dev web server that is based on Webpack dev server. We're not going to cover the Vue CLI service in depth in this course, but you can learn more about it here. For now, we're just going to go ahead and run this serve script. So back in our terminal, we can just run npm run serve. And that's going to compile our application for development and then start a development server for us on port 8080. There we go. Now let's go take a look at that. Cool. So you can see that we have a running application here. And this is the sample web page that always gets generated from the CLI. This just gives us a good starting point that we can start editing. So let's take a look at how this is all working and being rendered. So back over here, we'll take a look at our main.js file in the source directory. This is the entry point for our Vue application, and you can see it's really simple. Notice we're just creating a new Vue instance here with the create app function imported from Vue, and we're passing the app component into the create app function. This is a Vue component that was created for us by the CLI. So when Vue bootstraps our app, it will start by displaying the app component. So let's take a look at that next. So first of all, notice that there are 3 sections to this file: a template section, a script section, and a style section. Clearly, this is not a file that a browser could understand. So the question is, how is this getting used? Well, consider a couple of things. First of all, there is a Vue-specific Webpack plugin being used to parse this file into its individual parts and compile them in a way that a browser can use them. And secondly, this component was passed into the Vue instance, so Vue will work with what's generated by Webpack to render this component. We'll talk more about components and each of these sections in the next module. For now, all you need to understand is that this app component is the top-level component in our app. And as we build our app, it will remain at the top level of our component hierarchy as it is used to display routed components and their child components. Right now, there is no routing at work here. The app component is just displaying this hello world component. So the app component is displaying this as a child component. And if we go look at that component, which is in this components folder, you can see that here is all the HTML and all the links that are currently being displayed in our app. Cool, so that's how everything is wired up that was generated by the CLI. Next, we'll start replacing this content with some of our own. All right, in this clip, we're going to start creating some of our own content. We won't be exploring any new concepts just yet. We're just going to spend a little bit of time replacing this generated content with some of our own content. This will get us a little more familiar with what the CLI generated and with the layout of our new app before we start digging into key Vue.js concepts. So let's start by renaming this Hello World component. This will become our new homepage. So let's name it homepage.vue. We could just name it home.vue, but one of the Vue style guide rules says that components should be 2 words at a minimum. So we'll name it homepage. And let's update the component name down here too. And then we'll have to update the import for this in the app component. So instead of importing hello world, we'll import homepage from homepage.vue, and then we'll use that down here. And we'll change it up here in the template. And we don't need this message attribute anymore, so we'll delete that. And I'd like to put all of this inside a main element. And we don't want this Vue logo up here anymore, so we'll delete that. All right, and then let's add a couple of styles and clean up some styles that we don't need. So down here in the style section of our app component, I'd like to add a gradient to the body of our application. So I'm going to give it a background. I'm going to set linear gradient to a gradient from top to bottom. And then I want to set the background attachment to fixed. And then down here on the app element, I'm just going to remove everything except for font family. And then I just want to add a few styles for this main div. So down here, I'll add a main style. And I want to set margin to 0 auto. So this will center the main content. Then we'll add some padding. And give it a background color of white. And a width of 1024 pixels. And then just a min height of 300 pixels. Okay, we'll talk more about components and styling them in the next module. We're just trying to get a decent starting point set up here, and then we'll delve into this stuff more. So let's go see what our site looks like now. Okay, ignore the main content area, but notice that our background has a gray gradient now, and our main content area has a white background. Now let's go replace all of this content with our homepage content. So back in our homepage component up here in the template. All right, so let's delete all of this content inside the outer div. And we'll change this class to home. And then I'm just going to go ahead and paste a little bit of content here. If you're following along,
go ahead and type this in.
And then notice that we just have a couple of divs here. One just has an image of a robot, and the other has a get started link. So notice that this image is loading robot home.png file out of the assets folder. But that file doesn't exist in here. This is just the Vue logo that came with our Vue CLI sample page. So let's go download that robot home PNG file. To help us with this and a number of other tasks throughout this course, I've created a little helper repo over here in GitHub for the Vue.js Fundamentals course. And there's just a few files in here that we will occasionally use to download things as we go throughout this course. So in the source folder, notice we have an assets folder, and here is the robot home PNG file. And we'll actually need this other image too, so we might as well download them both. So first I'll click on robot home, and then click on download, and then save image as. And then I just need to go find my build-a-bot folder. And in the assets folder, we'll just save it here. And then we can go back and do the same thing for this build-a-bot logo. So we'll save that here too. So now that robot home image exists in our assets folder. Now we just need to clean up some styles down here. And we don't need any of these. Okay, so cool. I'm just going to add a few classes here. So we have a home class, and I just want that to be text-align center. And then a robot class. And I just want to set the height to 300 pixels. This is for that robot image. So let's go see what our site looks like now. Okay, cool. This is looking great now. And you may have noticed that I didn't need to hit refresh on this page in order to see my changes. That's because we are using, behind the scenes, Vue CLI is using the Webpack dev server, including hot module replacement. So as we make changes to our code, the changes immediately show up in our browser without us having to refresh. Okay, awesome. So now we've created a new home page. But let's add one more thing that we're going to use throughout this course. Our site is missing a navigation header. So let's add that quick. And we could add that to our home component. But then when we navigate away from our home page, we would lose that navigation header. So really, we want it to be on our app component. So up here, just above our main element, we're going to add a header element. And that's going to have a nav element. And this nav element is nothing special. It's not Vue specific. It's just a normal HTML element. And then inside here, we're going to use a unordered list to list out each of the nav elements. And for now, that's just going to have one list element. And that will have a nav item class. And then inside here, we're going to have an image, which will be our logo. So we'll give that a logo class. And this is going to be the other image that we downloaded. So in our assets folder, it is the build a bot logo PNG file. And then we'll just say build a bot here. And now we just need to add some styles to style that. Again, we'll cover styling in more depth in the next module. But rather than have you type in all the styles, let's go over to our helper repo. And in the source folder, there is this header.css. And we're just going to click on the raw version of that and copy all of it. And then let's just paste that all in right here. Okay, so you can see we're just adding some header and nav item styling here and some styling for our logo. Okay, let's go take a look at that. All right, awesome. So you can see here, again, without having to refresh, hot module replacement just updated our page for us. And we now have a navigation bar at the top with a list item here on the left for navigating to our home page. And that's not a link yet or anything. We'll update that later. But now we have a home page with a navigation bar in our app component. And I realize that this clip was just a bit of just following along, not a lot of new concepts. But hopefully as we moved around in the app and replaced some HTML in our homepage component and our app component, you began to become a little bit more familiar with the layout of our application. And hopefully that will help it going forward. In the next module, we're going to dive into components and template syntax and start learning a lot more concepts. So in this module, we just learned some high-level things about Vue and how to use the Vue CLI to create a project, and a little bit about working within components and making some HTML and CSS changes. In the next module, we're going to take a much deeper look at components and template syntax. So let's go jump into that.